welcome. After decades of preaching the virtues of free markets and directly or indirectly imposing free trade policies on most of the rest of the world, the United States is now the leading protectionist in the world. Since the first hours of his administration, starting on January 20th, the US president began waving the threat of raising tariffs on international imports, starting with Mexico and Canada, but soon spreading to the entire world. On April 10th, the US administration applied a 10% baseline tariff against all imports entering the United States, and on April 9th, imposed additional tariffs on many countries. Most of those tariffs have been postponed for a 90-day period, with the exception of those on China. To understand the Trump tariffs, their goals and their impact on the US and the global economy, and in particular, the impact on industrialization in the global South, I'm joined by Professors Francisco Rodriguez and Firat Demir. Professor Francisco Rodriguez is Rice Family Professor of the Practice of International and Public Affairs at the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver, while Firat Demir is the David Boren and L.J. Semrod Presidential Professor of Economics at the University of Oklahoma. Thank you both for joining me today. Francisco, I'm going to start with you. Tell us from your perspective, what do you see as the underlying logic here, if we can see one? What is the rationale? What does Trump ultimately want to do? And perhaps, like, what is his theory of change? How is it going to be brought about through these actions?
Yes. Well, thanks very much, Omar, for the opportunity to have this conversation. So my thinking on this is that what we're seeing isn't primarily about tariff policy. Now, the president has announced huge changes. I mean, he basically declared economic war on the rest of the world, and then he has backtracked, and now he said, well, it's primarily targeted at China. So what we've seen has been a dramatic turnaround in policy, one of the most erratic policy episodes in U.S. economic history, I think. But when all was said and done, there was one very important change that had occurred, which is that the president had asserted his authority to impose tariffs by decree. And I think that this is remarkably important. Donald Trump is the first president that uses this authority. He's using the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, which had previously been used to impose sanctions. Now he's using it to impose tariffs. And that's something that Congress isn't questioning. Some legislators have, but Congress doesn't seem to, as a whole, to be prepared to question it. And we see this type of moves taken by the administration across several dimensions of policy. The Department of Government Efficiency isn't really about cutting costs. And in fact, fiscal data has shown that expenditures continue to increase year on year. And it might actually be that the gutting of the IRS is going to lead the deficit to increase. But what we have is a very clear signal to the civil service that they work at the command of the chief executive. So I think that this is really about asserting power in a way that is actually not unusual in cases of democratic backsliding and authoritarian consolidation. I have studied this type of politics in Venezuela, in Zimbabwe, and many other countries that have experienced periods of democratic backsliding. And what you see is that sometimes there are moves that appear to be economically irrational, but they make complete political sense because they have to do with concentration of authority. That doesn't mean that there isn't an ideology behind it. Yes, there are competing ideologies because leaders like Trump have competing ideologies in their teams. They have different teams that have different views, and that partly they thrive on the instability that generates. I think that we have one view in the administration which says this is about the art of the deal. This is about aggressively changing our bargaining stance so that we can get better deals and so that we can get free trade agreements that open up international markets to U.S. exports. There's another part that associated with Peter Navarro, which is very strongly protectionist and which does want to shift towards protectionism. Do we know which way we'll ultimately go? I don't think that we can say so because I think that Trump is very aware, is very conscientiously having these two groups fight it out because that gives him the ultimate power. But I would go back to something that Trump said actually when he was backtracking on the tariffs on April 9th. He said, "Well, we're going to approve exemptions for companies to the tariffs." And he was asked, "Well, how are you going to do it?" And his response was instinctively. And I think that that's a very important message. He was saying the power to determine who gets exempted or not is here. It's at the president's office. So that's how I think that this is operating. It's about reshaping the politics of how commercial policy gets done so as to give the chief executive much more discretional authority.
Thanks, Firat. What do you think about what's driving this?
I completely agree. But we also maybe we should take a step back. And U.S. trade deficit, which it is running with the rest of the world since 1981, has always been highlighted as a serious problem, both for the U.S. and for the rest of the world. Countries like China, Japan, and Germany were running large trade deficits, which the other side of that meant U.S. Surplus, and the U.S. was running large trade deficits that compensated that. So many international organizations, pretty much every economist that I know have agreed and had a consensus that the trade deficits of the United States are not sustainable. Now, everybody's focusing on the trade deficit, but the US at the same time is running a large services surplus. So as the US moved into a service-based economy, it started running large amounts of services surplus with the rest of the world. So Trump is focused on the trade deficits. And I have a couple guesses. It's really hard to tell what the president has in mind exactly when he's attacking the trade deficits. But the way I see it is that Trump sees trade deficits as reflecting decreasing U.S. competitiveness, that the U.S. has become much less competitive with the rest of the world, and that is pretty much caused by unfair trade practices that are imposed on the U.S. through unfair trade deals and currency manipulation. And both of them are disadvantaging U.S. businesses, causing U.S. to run a trade deficit. And he sees this as in a very mercantilist way. The way they saw the trade surpluses as a measure of the health of the economy, because the mercantilists compared the trade surplus as the blood in the body system. And if you are running trade deficits, you are getting sick, basically, you are losing blood. And therefore, they would try to maximize trade surpluses to maximize the health and well-being and the welfare of the economy. So he sees that with tariffs, I think, one, he thinks that tariffs will reduce trade deficits and therefore leakages in the national wealth. It will help return jobs and investment back to the US, including manufacturing, which were among his campaign promises. This will also, I think, generate revenue. He said many times, and his advisors voiced that opinion many times, that holding everything else constant, that is assuming that the U.S. will continue to have as much exports and imports, that increasing tariffs will raise revenue, that consumers will continue to import as much stuff from China, and they will pay this extra tariff, which is a tax on consumers, and it will generate income for the federal government, which will help them then cut taxes on corporations and higher income individuals, and perhaps some at the lower end as well, such as Social Security and minimum wage earners. He also wants to make the US dollar the reserve currency forever and ever by strengthening the US economy. Now, he also threatened other countries with economic warfare if they ever considered switching away from the US dollar. Now, they seem to have changed that opinion because the White House has a white paper that also says that it should not have the reserve currency status, which is harming the US economy, they argued. Now, I think these are all incompatible goals. You cannot run a trade surplus, have a strong currency, have high tariffs and other trade barriers at the same time. It's just not compatible. The balance of payments, which is an accounting principle, every transaction in the international trading system is entered twice. So the fact that the US is running a trade deficit means it is running a financial account surplus. And financial account reflects the amount of investment in the United States as well as the amount of borrowing. So the US economy can handle to run trade deficits because the rest of the world is willing to invest in the US or extend buy U.S. debt instruments and extend loans to the U.S. So if you are going to reduce trade deficits with higher tariff barriers and so on, it may help reduce trade deficit, not through exports and imports, but through discouraging foreign governments and foreign investors from investing in the United States, which is the opposite of what the president seems to want to do. If Chinese investors or German investors stop buying US assets, be that stocks, be that bonds, or physical assets like investing in plants, equipment, machinery, if they stop doing that, the US will have to reduce its consumption of foreign goods and services, which will help improve the trade balance, but it will come at the expense of a recession, increasing unemployment, and increasing prices for domestic consumers. So the so-called exorbitant privilege that the US is enjoying for a long time, that the dollar is the reserve currency since 1946 pretty much, is not a burden for the US. It has been a privilege and a significant benefit and boost to the US economy. Because think about it. Now, the Chinese has to produce real goods and services, sell it to the US.
Let me stop you right there because we're going to get into that in more detail. But before we get into that, since the big looming question here is, of course, vis-a-vis China, and you mentioned that a couple times, obviously confronting China has become part of U.S. military national security doctrine as framed several years ago. It's a bipartisan consensus. There's U.S. policy vis-a-vis the rest of the world, but also there are certain policy goals with respect to China. So maybe we can hone in a little bit about what do we see the dynamics versus China? Is there, is there a way in which basically Trump thinks maybe both economies will lose, but China will lose more, and therefore this is a chance to really damage the Chinese economy? Maybe we can, elaborate a little bit on these specific dynamics with China a bit. Francisco, what do you think?
Well, I think that the dynamic that has emerged with China, as you mentioned, yes, there has been a consensus on China bashing, which strengthened remarkably during the first Trump administration and then is maintained force during the Biden administration. But nevertheless, Trump 2 is in many respects very different from Trump 1. So I don't think that that was necessarily built in. And I think that what happened is that China had a very assertive reaction, and this created a problem for Trump's strategy. So the way in which Trump's strategy was supposed to work is, I'm going to make this threat and everybody's going to back down. And then I'm going to have countries that are going to be negotiating bilaterally with me. And that's going to allow me to sell to the American public, hey, I'm the ultimate deal maker. Look at the deal that I achieved. I was right. All of these countries are treating us unfairly, and they're going to stop treating us unfairly because I did what I did. But China didn't back down. China didn't try to appease him. China essentially has decided to retaliate tit for tat. And now that puts Trump in a bind because, and here's the other part of the story is that Trump backtracked because he had to. He effectively met a constraint. And that constraint, I think, was both market and it was political. The market constraint was that the magnitude of the sell-off in stocks surprised them, and the magnitude of the sell-off in treasuries concerned them, and it concerned them for a very good reason. The U.S. has a debt to GDP ratio, which is around 100% of GDP, depending on how you calculate it. It has there's overwhelming consensus on is an unsustainable fiscal situation. I mean, we can discuss about the trade deficit, but definitely the US's fiscal deficit is unsustainable. So this is a situation where if the rest of the world decides that it's not going to finance you, then it becomes really problematic. So I think that these two factors forced him to backtrack, but he did it in a way partly in which he could save face, but partly also, and I want to come back to this argument that I do think that we have an underlying project of accumulating power, of authoritarian consolidation, which has to do essentially with undermining democratic checks and balances. And I think that if you look at that type of political projects around the world, scapegoats are extremely important. Scapegoats are extremely important because they allow you to maintain an internal narrative that helps mobilize your political base. So in that context, it's very important for Trump to be able to shift to a narrative where there is an external enemy, a clear external enemy, and China in that sense is a convenient choice. The additional point that I would emphasize is that Trump backtracked, yes, but he backtracked in a way in which he maintained his authority, and he backtracked essentially saying we're going to revisit this in 90 days. But backtracking is also not unusual in this type of political projects. I'm reminded, for example, of the time in 2007 when Hugo Chavez said that he was pulling Venezuela out of the International Monetary Fund. And this caused a sell-off in the country's debt markets because all of the country's bonds had clauses that stated that withdrawal from the IMF would be a default event. And Hugo Chavez quietly backtracked on that decision. But that doesn't mean that he backtracked on the mission of concentrating power. And it also doesn't mean that he backtracked on his decision to diminish any scope of important or relevant relations with the IMF. In fact, Venezuela has not had an Article 4 consultation since 2004, which is in clear violation of the IMF Articles of Agreement. And this was the same time at which Chavez carried out a referendum that allowed him to extend term limits and to re-elect himself indefinitely, in which he nationalized oil service providers. So there is an underlying logic in which strategic retreats can make sense. But ultimately, the project of consolidating power in the hands of the executive is one that continues.
Well, with that actually brings me to another question that I had that I think we could talk a little bit about, because one of the continued statements of President Trump, well, one of them is this grievance narrative that the rest of the world is taking advantage of the US, and that the US economy is not great and is going to be made great again. But of course, we know, and your work, Francisco, and of course, Firat, is the dominant position of the US in the international economy, right? I mean, China did not create the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, or the IMF. China does not hold the kind of reserve currency of the world. So can we talk a little bit about, and since you mentioned Venezuela, and you've done a lot of work, Francisco, in particular, about the sanctions and the ways they've harmed the Venezuelan economy, and that's due to the power that the US has in the sense of imposing sanctions on the rest of the world and limiting financial transactions. For those who have a general sense of the US privilege in the global economy, can we talk a little bit more about what some of those details are, and how does the US actually benefit, and what is its kind of dominant position in the international economy? Firat, I'll start with you and I'll come back to Francisco.
No, that's a great point. And following the Francisco's comments on China, I think there's that, but also if you look at the continuation of demonization of China, it's going back way before even the first Trump administration. If you remember that under Obama administration, the US government took significant steps to curtail the rise of China, including the detention of the chief financial officer of the Huawei, which at the time was the second largest IT company in the world, right after Samsung. Its cell phone, for example, share in the market was above Apple. And through sanctions and other economic warfare means, Huawei is now not even in the top 5 globally. So China was seen as the strategical rival, the rise of which needed to be prevented through different methods and tools, including economic warfare, sanctions, preventing accessing 5G or microchip markets, and technology from countries including Netherlands to the rest of the world. And for that, Obama administration was using mostly the trade agreements that would bring together certain global South countries, but entire global North countries together as a bloc against China to limit its expansion. Now, the only difference from Obama to Trump and then to Biden and again to Trump is the tools they use and the methods they use. In fact, the Chinese government welcomed the first Trump administration, at least according to the most news, when he was first in office, compared to Obama administration, because of Trump's backing off from Trans-Pacific Partnership and other agreements. Now, having said that, if you look at the advantages and privileges the U.S. enjoys, as you already said, in 1945, the Bretton Woods institutions were created, with the U.S. being the largest shareholder in two of them, World Bank and IMF. No country can change the quota structure of these two institutions without having 85% majority. The US controls 17% of the total votes and quota system, and therefore US has a monopoly power in dominating these two institutions. And if you add GATT or WTO after 1995 on top of that, the entire global rules of engagement in international trade and international finance was written literally by the United States. Now, saying that other countries took advantage of the US in those deals probably is far from the truth. And if you look at the details of trade negotiations with other countries, the US delegation would include hundreds of experts, legal and economists on each article to negotiate, when the rest of the world would have one or two representatives for the entire nation. The same applies to tariffs. If you look at global tariff rates, the global South countries has been at the disadvantage, at the losing end of the global trade rules. For example, 40% of European Union budget is spent on agricultural subsidies. And developing countries have no access to European common market in agricultural goods. But they were forced to open up their manufacturing markets and industrial goods, where they have pretty much no comparative advantage with the global North countries. The same applies to the US dollar as a reserve currency. The US enjoyed significant advantages from the dollar being the reserve currency. Give an example. The sneakers, take Nike sneakers manufactured in Vietnam. Vietnamese workers have to work to produce those, and businesses have to work to produce those shoes. They give it to American consumers. In exchange, they get a piece of paper that is backed up by nothing. So the only thing US needs to do to buy those goods, which are manufactured with real people, with sweat and blood, literally, and the only thing they have to do is to print paperback. That is a significant advantage that no other country enjoys. Plus, US has the most and the biggest advantage, in my view, that is it can borrow unlimited amounts in its own currency. If you look at global markets in bonds and other debt instruments, US dollar is the king, and the US government and private investors and households can borrow in their own currency unlimited amounts at very low interest rates. No other country enjoys this. Now, if you link this perhaps with the question on China and what implications it would have, I just pulled out some numbers yesterday looking at the latest US debt figures and also the US trade deficits and surpluses and what implications this may have. So we can hold on to the Chinese part perhaps for later questions. But if you look at the total debt as of March 2025, the total national debt of the United States was $29 trillion. 21% of this is short term, amounting roughly $6 trillion. Okay. And the interest cost on treasury bills, which is the short term, so if it is less than a year, we call them T-bills. If it is longer, we call them bonds. The interest cost on the bills was $98 billion in 2024. And on bonds was 37. So in total, give and take, $136 billion the United States paid on interest in 2024. Now, that looks a lot, but looking at the size of the debt and the interest rates on it, this is a significant advantage that US, both taxpayers and the government, enjoyed being able to borrow at very low rates. Now, the current transition may change that. So a 1 percentage point increase in that debt will mean literally tens of billions of dollars extra debt payments on interest servicing alone. And that is something that I don't think the current tariff warfare is considering. China is the second largest holder of US Treasury securities, okay? And it is reducing it. So in 2019, Chinese share of total external Treasury securities held by foreign countries, Chinese share was 15% of that. Today, it is less than 10%. In fact, in January, it was 10%. In January 24, 10% of the total Treasury securities was held by the Chinese government. Now, they dropped to 19%. In a year, they reduced it by 1%, which is significant in terms of dollar share. Japan is the largest holder. Japan share also dropped from 14 to 13% during the same period in just 1 year. A 1 percentage point increase on that debt is significant. Now, what happens if China starts selling those bonds? Again, it would have huge crashing effects on the US economy. The interest rate would soar, which we see in the bonds market already in the last week. The cost of borrowing for US government would increase. And there's nothing the US would be able to do to stop that. The US would have two options. Either it would continue offering higher and higher interest rates to convince foreign borrowers that it is worth the risk to invest in the US by compensating them for the increase in risk premiums, or the US will have to go through a significant belt tightening. It will have to cut the domestic absorption and consumption by the same amount, which would mean higher unemployment and recession for sure.
Thanks, Firat. Francisco, I wanted to ask you something specific about the work that you've been doing lately on sanctions, and particularly since the work on Venezuela in particular, and this additional tariffs that apparently Marco Rubio now has the discretion to impose.
Mhm.
Can you explain that a little bit? How usual or unusual is it within the kind of toolbox of US economic warfare, especially that you've documented the rise of the use of sanctions by the US? Is Trump shifting away from sanctions? Is he going to keep sanctions and tariffs? But also, can you explain a little bit what's happening vis-a-vis Venezuela in particular?
Sure. Yeah, well, I mean, it's actually very interesting because what Trump decided in the case of Venezuela was to impose secondary tariffs. And when I first heard him say on a post in Truth Social that he was imposing secondary tariffs, it was somewhat puzzling because this term has never been used in economics with that meaning. Essentially, what Trump was referring to is a mixture between secondary sanctions and tariffs. So secondary sanctions are typically imposed when you want to stop another country from trading with a sanctioned country. So, for example, if the US imposes sanctions on Venezuela, technically what that means is that Americans can't buy Venezuelan oil. But the US wants to stop other countries like Spain, like India, like China from buying Venezuelan oil, then it has to threaten to sanction the companies in those countries that buy that oil. But what Trump did was that he threatened not the companies that buy the oil, but the countries. He actually said, if you buy Venezuelan oil, then we will impose an additional 25% tariff on all of the imports from your country. So that if China, on top of the 125% that it has now, if China were, according to his statement, to continue buying Venezuelan oil, then that would go up to 150. Now, however, it's actually quite interesting that the administration hasn't used this power. But again, to my earlier point, it asserted this power, and it asserted it in a way that is actually quite remarkable because it transferred this power to the Secretary of State. So we're no longer just talking about the president taking an authority which he was originally granted under very specific conditions to restrict international transactions, which is the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, which, by the way, was originally the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, which was granted to Woodrow Wilson so that the president could take action to restrict international transactions with the countries that the US was at war with. So Trump has taken this authority, used it to impose tariffs, and then also said, not only am I as president assuming it, I am transferring it to an appointee of the executive branch, to the Secretary of State. But it's really important to bring this back to the broader question. And I agree totally with what Firat was saying in this respect, which is that there is an inconsistency in what the government, the Trump administration claims that it's trying to do. One way of thinking about what has been happening over the course of the well, I mean, generally over the course of post-war economic history is that the U.S., as Firat expressed, has been financing itself with the willingness of the rest of the world to accept dollars. Now, that has sometimes been seen as, well, this is an unsustainable trade deficit. I think that you can have another vision of it, which is that the US actually exports dollars. The US is willing to and is able to sell a commodity to the rest of the world that the rest of the world wants and needs. Why does the rest of the world want and need this currency? Well, because for the same reason that any economy needs a common currency. There is a convenience to using the same currency that other people want to use. So if a firm in Colombia wants to export to Brazil, the Brazilian firm is going to typically demand payment in a US bank account in dollars. So that gives the US extraordinary power. But it also comes out of the willingness of the rest of the world to accept these dollars. And what happens if that power is undermined? Now, the US cannot continue doing this if it's going to close its trade deficit, but also the willingness to hold dollars and the willingness to continue to use dollars to transact also depends on the perceived security of property rights in the United States. And that is what I think is being fundamentally undermined here. And there's something very interesting that we've seen over the course of the past few days. This is the first global crisis in recent economic history where we have not seen a flight to safety towards the dollar. The 2008 financial crisis was a US-born economic crisis. It was provoked by the subprime mortgage crisis. There was the collapse of Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. And nevertheless, people wanted to hold dollars during that crisis. During the COVID pandemic, same, people wanted to hold dollars. What we've seen here is that now when stocks started selling off, the dollar started selling off. When Trump backtracked on his tariff announcements, the dollar continued selling off, and it's already lost about 9%. So I think that this is extremely problematic for the US because its ability to get other countries to do what it wants, that exercise of monetary hard power that comes through these threats of secondary sanctions, depends on the fact that the dollar is the go-to currency for international transactions. If that no longer happens, then the US does not have that power. The US, for example, in 2019 imposed sanctions on Iran. And it caused a decline of 25% in Iranian oil exports. But the US has not bought Iranian oil since 1979. This was purely the threat that companies that bought Iranian oil would be sanctioned by the US. But the reason that companies are concerned with the force of those sanctions is because those companies need access to the US dollar. You undermine that, you undermine the basis of US monetary power.
That's a great point, and actually maybe a topic for a future conversation about, where is this, where are these actions actually taking U.S. primacy in terms of its, kind of economic privilege in the world. But I want to actually shift the discussion to the rest of the global South, not the U.S. and not China, and kind of merge my last two questions together and maybe have a discussion among us about this, because those of us who kind of studied economics in the 90s and maybe early 2000s, and especially international economics, the mantra in the discipline at that time and also in the kind of international economy was the Washington Consensus, was the kind of Thatcher, Reagan, and then subsequent Clinton imposed neoliberal economic order, free trade, and eventually free capital flows, and so on. That was what was, in many ways, involuntarily imposed on much of the global South, particularly in the aftermath of the early 1980s debt crisis. And I remember one of the great articles that we read was by Francisco and Danny Roderick, A Skeptic's Guide on the evidence of the idea that openness is what is going to lead to growth, and kind of casting doubt about this, among other few dissenting voices. And of course, since then we've completely shifted away from that. But part of the critique of those actions, of course, at the time was that it was forcing a deindustrialization of the global South. It was stunting development in many of the countries, for example, in Africa, that was newly independent and they had just kind of started the development process, only to be set back by the 1980s crisis, elsewhere in Latin America as well. So my question to you, and maybe this is a bit speculative, but thinking about where does these tariffs, and also where are we now in terms of development in the global South? What are the prospects for development? Are these tariffs, for example, are these changes from the global hegemon providing cover and ability for other countries to then think about resuming industrial policy? Is industrial policy still possible in the rest, quote unquote, the rest of the global South? Is it going to increase South-South cooperation? Where do we see the question of development and structural change in the global South right now? And Firat, I'll go to you first and end with Francisco.
Yeah, again, let's take a look at the numbers. So before the US managed to impose its own version of development policy on both global North and global South, because A, it's control over the US dollar and international financial system, and two, its market in the world economy. It had the biggest market, and therefore it could use it as a leverage, when it comes to sanctions against countries like Iran with the nuclear non-proliferation agreement. It could convince its European allies to follow the same because it had significant sanctioning power. Now, US accounts roughly 11% of global exports market and 16% of imports market. 16% of total imports in the world goes to the US. That's significant. But China now controls for around 14% of exports and 11% of the imports market. So US market is big, but is not the only one in the world. China and global South countries seems to have already accelerated their integration since the first Trump administration. But before that, the bilateral trade agreements within and between global South countries, as well as global North and South countries, has increased significantly. That is partly because of the bypassing of WTO by the Obama and then Trump administrations. And that opens up a lot of, I think, room for global South countries in terms of what they can do. This trade disruptions and changing of alliances allows global South countries to have basically more to choose from a wider variety of options, both with each other, but also with more or larger leading emerging South countries such as Turkey, Brazil, Argentina, Brazil, China, and Russia as well. And those trade agreements will be more beneficial, without a doubt, I think, than the ones that they signed with the US or with European Union also, when they did not have any alternatives. Now, when it comes to industrial policy, I'm not so sure what kind of industrial policy space they will have, but definitely it will be a wider set of options than the one they had before, when they were imposed or were forced to have certain trade rules with the United States or with European Union. China is the game changer here. It already is trying to capitalize on the most recent developments by showing that it's a more reliable ally, that you can trade with China without having the type of conditions imposed. And we see the same thing on the financial side. China already is the largest lender for African countries compared to World Bank, IMF, or United States or European Union. So the financial landscape of development is much wider and much more open because of players such as China, Turkey, and others that allow more experimentation, whatever that fits or whatever that means for individual countries. But it is not a sufficient condition either. It's a necessary condition to be able to experiment, but at the end of the day, it boils down to each country's capabilities. What they can do is a function of what actually they can do, given their endowments, including ability to negotiate, ability to experiment, and climb up the production ladder in terms of what they produce and sell to the rest of the world. So I see it as a more optimistic landscape in terms of policy space that is more flexible, that is more forgiving, that respects individual sovereignty in terms of the policies that they are using. And the opposite probably will be the case for the US, because if China can, and they are trying in the last 2 weeks, bring European Union and Canada and Japan and the rest of Asia together and agree on a common set of rules, that will be definitely more beneficial for the global South than the current rules.
What do you think, Francisco?
I think it's actually quite interesting to view this from the standpoint of this long run perspective of development policies that you articulated. Um, and the literature on trade liberalization and free market reforms and growth is as voluminous as it is inconclusive. But there are some striking facts. The most successful country in the world in terms of economic growth and in terms of poverty reduction in these past 30 years has been China, a country that completely bucked and rejected the Washington Consensus. And China was not the poster boy for the Washington Consensus. Argentina was the poster boy for the Washington Consensus. So what we saw happen during the course of these past decades has been quite interesting because we did see a success, and you refer to my work with Danny, and that work was about trade policy and economic growth, not about openness. And we're very careful about framing it and framing the question as being what are the effects of trade policy and whether moving to a policy of free trade, reducing trade barriers, going with the market consensus on trade liberalization was optimal. So what did we see during the course of these past decades? We saw that East Asia did very well. Now, it did very well, even though, and this was something that was first recognized by Al Sampson and then by Robert Wade and fabulously documented in Isabella Weber's recent work. And what we saw is that countries in East Asia managed their entrance to the market so that they could take advantage of global market opportunities by carrying out industrial policy that allowed them to be able to move up global value chains. That's what Latin America was not able to do. So Latin America very aggressively liberalized it. It followed the standard economics comparative advantage textbook. Let's specialize in what we're good at. And they ended up stuck at the lower end of global value chains. It's interesting that, again, we can have a huge discussion as to the effects of free market reforms, but, paraphrasing Robert Solow, in the case of Latin America, you can see free market reforms everywhere except in the productivity statistics. And that's actually quite remarkable. There has been no increase in productivity post-Washington Consensus reforms. So that tells you that something is seriously wrong. And I think that at the base of this problem is a more fundamental issue of state capacity. Latin American states are traditionally weak. They are much more subject to state capture. And this has to do partly with the origins of these states. And what that means is that these are states that are not good at providing public goods. Because in order to provide public goods, you have to have a state that can assert its authority over elites. If the state does not have that authority, then what elites will do will be that they will parcelize the state and use the state to extract rents from it. So that's why we have the chronic under-provision of infrastructure in Latin America, which we don't have in East Asia. And that is why East Asia found it so much easier to be able to move up the global value chain. Now, what does this mean for the developing world? Well, it depends. It depends again on whether Trump is really serious about closing off the U.S. economy. I think that for the reasons that Firat also articulated, the U.S. is not necessarily going to win a trade war with China. First of all, the Chinese economy is larger than that of the U.S. in purchasing power parity adjusted terms, which is what matters because we're talking about the production of actual goods and services. So that is a very important impediment to trying to get the rest of the world to trade with me and not trade with China. And then the other point, which Farad also emphasized, is that sure, the U.S. can put tariffs on Chinese imports, and the U.S. imports more than China, and China can sell off treasuries whenever it wants and provoke a fiscal crisis in the U.S. So I don't think that this is necessarily going to end up well, which is why the U.S. may very well end up backtracking also on the China threat. But let's suppose that it goes, or at least it goes in this direction to some extent, and we have an erection of trade barriers around the world. I think that that's going to hurt China. I think that it's going to hurt East Asia because these are countries that thrived on their ability to sell cheap goods to the US and to industrial and countries in advanced economies. So I don't think that there's a way around it. I mean, these countries did have an economic model that allowed them to benefit from access to global markets. Now, the case of Latin America, I think it's a bit different because in the case of Latin America, remember that the Great Depression was actually good for Latin America, and that's something quite remarkable because when the Great Depression hit, it ended up being a stimulus to industrialization in the region. The current mode of insertion of Latin American economies, which is by producing primary goods, by producing minerals and oil and agricultural goods for the rest of the world, is something that isn't really working for Latin America. So I do think that if we go to a world economy that is more partitioned into trading blocks, that might actually end up being relatively beneficial to countries that haven't been able to find a way to take advantage of globalization. And it may even be a mechanism through which states can become more assertive vis-a-vis domestic elites, which is the real underlying problem, that of state capture.
Thank you so much. I like that you touched on the origins of industrialization in Latin America, and one of our Firat and my mentors, Professor Jaime Ross, taught us about the origins of
Yes.
development policy as coming from the shock that Latin American elites had, that they thought they had free trade agreements with England and so on, and they were, shocked by these tariffs, which gave rise to the industrializing forces. And I'm reminded of this because I'm wondering what's going through Javier Milei's mind, that the US Secretary of Agriculture has said now, we're not going to be importing any more Argentine beef, uh, given the friendship supposedly and the ideological kinship that Milei has shown with Trump and his team. And interesting to see how it's going to play out in Argentina. With that, I want to thank you both. This has been a great introduction and overview on this topic. We touched on several aspects of it, and of course, there's a lot more that we can talk about, and hopefully, we'll have you back at another time soon to follow up. Thank you for your time.